we're the ones, if you're looking at economists to give you the rhetoric, you might be looking in the wrong place. But I'll just say a couple things on that and then flip directions a little bit. One is with right to work, again, I hate the phrase because you've lost if you give them that phrase. I mean, I always talk about it as freedom of contract, and for whatever it's worth, it drives them nuts when you put it in those terms. But I use that because it's not inaccurate. I mean, I think the rhetoric is more favorable, but it's also, you go, what exactly is at issue? Because, they don't, again, I want to go work at Burger King, and they tell me I have to wear this stupid uniform. I go, well, I want to work there, and I don't. Well, about my right to work, I don't want to wear this stupid uniform. I go, well, you have a right to work somewhere else. But somehow, if all the employees at Burger King get together and go, oh, we're going to have a union, and everyone's going to share in that cost. So you want to work here, you have to share in that cost. They go, oh, but what about your right to work? So I really don't understand. There is no logic. It's just saying the employers get to do whatever they want. Your fellow workers don't have any say. So I don't. We should never, ever, ever let them call it right to work because it's not accurate. And but the other thing, this is kind of my book, rigged. I'm not. Well, I am plugging it, but it's free, so I'm not going to make any money to get that one off the web. But, I think what we've given them away, you mentioned Buchanan, I haven't read the book, I've read several reviews of the book, and I think it'll replace Buchanan's role, but the basic point is right, they had this market ideology, and I think part of the story here is we've given them this whole idea of the market, but we haven't challenged, the ways in which they've structured the market, and I just give one that, should drive it home. How rich would Bill Gates be, the richest man in the world, if he did have patent and copyright protection on Windows and other Microsoft products? My guess is he'd still be working for a living. Well, God did not give us patents and copyrights. That was U.S. Congress. That was the law. That's interference with the market. These are monopolies. Now, I understand the purpose. They have a purpose, of course, and we can argue whether they're too strong, they're too weak, they're alternative mechanisms. I mean, all those things are arguable points. But what is not an arguable point is these are interventions in the market. I will get arrested if I start making copies of Windows and putting them out, and all you guys can get it from. I will get arrested for that. Bill Gates will be put in jail. Okay, but there's all sorts of ways like that where they've had the market structured to give them all the money, and we act like, oh, that was just the market. Well, you've lost when you act like that's just the market. So I think it's really important that we not basically give away the argument and then see if we can convince people, because you won't.
Yeah, just two quick things on right to work, although don't call it that. I mean, one, I think at the level of rhetoric, or because it's also true, I mean, what it really is, well, it's a right to free ride. It's basically telling people, you have a right to go into a workplace that has voluntarily decided to join together and form a union, and administering the contract and doing the union activities, it costs money. And the way the union pays for that is by taking dues from everyone, and everyone's agreed to that. But you're allowed to come in and say, you have to represent me, the contract has to apply to me, but I'm not going to pay. That's what right to work is. And then on the sort of empirical level, what it mostly does is lower wages. It has almost no other economic effect that you can really find in the data, and that's not a coincidence. That, in my mind, is pretty much the point of it. People, and so it works in that regard. So I think it's mostly a right to let people be free riders, and then it hurts everyone in the aggregate. And so those, to me, are the two big arguments for it.
David? Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Porno.
I'm Beverly Bacon, and there's a lot of talk
Mic isn't working.
It isn't working. Maybe change.
Just turn it up.
It is working.
I can yell louder. Beverly Bacon. A lot of talk lately about moving to a gig economy where people aren't really tied to a specific employer beyond the duration of a project or a short-term assignment. I don't see how that eliminates unions, because I think Hollywood is a good example where they have clearly a gig economy, but everybody is unionized. But how do you see us moving towards that kind of economy and unions' role in that? Do you see that being a smooth thing, or do you think that's actually not really the future anyway?
Yeah, I'll take it. So I would say we've looked a lot at sort of the broader category of non-standard work arrangements. And so the gig economy, where your work is mediated by an online platform, Lyft, Uber, TaskRabbit, that's still pretty tiny. And who knows, maybe it grows, maybe it doesn't. To my mind, whatever. Uber is mostly a symptom of an economy of low wages, and if wages ever start rising because we do the right policy things, their business model will be under a lot of stress, and then it'll be interesting. To me, the bigger issue with non-standard work arrangements is the contracting out issue. And so it's the issue that, like, there was once a time when, like, the cafeteria and janitorial staff at, like, General Motors were on GM's payroll, and now they're not. And someone, a guy named David Weil, who was a Labor Department official under the Obama administration and is a genuine intellectual and observer of the labor market, a professor at, I think, Boston University, he calls this the fissured economy. And this idea that basically the way I see it, as firms look at their low-wage employees, and maybe 30 years ago you're like, I could fire all my janitors and rehire them with another company, but I wouldn't say that much because, the economy at large has got a pretty tight labor market and wages are up and the federal minimum wage is actually kind of high and there wouldn't be that much savings. All of a sudden is we just sort of really annihilate all of the things that would support those janitors' wages if they were thrown out of GM. It becomes really tempting. And so they were thrown out of GM. And so you've got this hiring of firms that exist solely to cut wages. I mean, GM could have just cut their own janitors' wages, but they're a union, and the union would have not liked it. It would have been bad for morale, but they essentially hire middlemen firms to resupply their janitors to them and their other staff at lower costs. And also, I think a big reason why firms do this is exactly to avoid unionization. I feel like it's a legal innovation to make it harder, because now you're not allowed to strike against, GM, because they go, they're not our employees. Like, if you don't you see this all the time at colleges. Harvard's cafeteria staff. They're not Harvard employees. And so when people complain to Harvard, how come your cafeteria staff makes so little? They go, don't know, not our employees. Nothing we can do about that. Of course there's something they can do about that. And so to me, a big part of that fissuring economy, that contracting out, that non-standard work arrangement, I think a big part of that is exactly yet another tactic to put a layer between them and efforts to actually organize a workplace. And so I think it's something that should be stopped, or at least we should put roadblocks in front of it if we ever want to give organizing efforts a real chance.
Okay, I think you have time for one more question.
Let me just throw a couple things in there. First off, one of the things with Uber, and I agree very much with Josh, it's over-exaggerated how important that is in the economy, but one of the things, there's a court case, and I have no idea how it will be determined, but it's being argued that if their employees are independent contractors, as a saying, then Uber is guilty of price fixing, and they violate antitrust law. And I don't know an easy way around that. I'm not a lawyer, but I do know people who are. I'd love to see them nailed on that. Just to emphasize Josh's point, I mean, we often talk about the minimum wage and how much higher it would be if it kept pace with inflation. We've also done the calculation. You could just say, suppose it kept pace with productivity growth. Now, that sounds strange. It did used to keep pace with productivity growth. So if you look at the minimum wage when we first established the federal minimum wage at 37 until 68, it kept pace very closely with productivity growth. If it had continued to do that, it would be about $19 an hour. It would be a very different world. So anyhow, I'll start with that.
Thank you. My name is Brad Swanson, and firstly, thank you very much for a really fascinating presentation tonight. I was unaware of a lot of the data in these slides, and I think it's very compelling what you've shown us. I just have one specific question, which is that in your chart that shows non-union preference, 30 years ago, when the population was much more unionized and unions were apparently more powerful, it's 65% would vote not to form a union, and only 30% to form a union. So could you please explain that discrepancy?
My guess, and you see this clearly in the Great Recession, the support for unionizing among non-union workers plummets during recessions. And the way I interpret that is people get really, really scared. And people who have a job hear a question about, do you want to make your employer really annoyed at you at this period of time when unemployment is really high, and they think to themselves, nope, I don't want to do that. And so the survey, the first data point is in 1984, which is coming off of a very steep recession. We had unemployment almost 11% at the beginning of 1983. And then you see that from 2007 to like 2011, you had a lot of indications, I think driven both by the recession and I think the bailout of the automakers, which was often successfully blamed on their unionized workforce, making them too expensive, which was just wildly overblown. Happy to talk about that. But I feel like that damaged sort of people's perceptions of unions a lot. So that part of how I interpret it is times of insecurity are not times when people rush to embrace an organization that is going to irritate the boss.
Okay, Sandra, I think
we're ready to wrap up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
well, no, thank you very much, Dean, Josh. This is fascinating, and I'm glad you can make it across the Potomac, the suburbs. This tells you people are going to feel. Thank you all for coming.